Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into something a little different today, but something I think we can all relate to. We're going to be looking at how narcissists approach compromise. Think about it. We all compromise every day, right?
Absolutely.
Whether it's letting someone merge in front of you in traffic or,
Yeah.
deciding where to go to dinner with friends. We give a little to get a little. It's just kind of part of how we function as a society.
Yeah.
But what happens when someone just flat out refuses to compromise? When they see any concession as like a total defeat,
Right.
things can get pretty messy pretty quickly. And that's what we're going to dig into today. Our source material for this deep dive is an article from the Narcissistic Abuse Network. It's called A Narcissist's Approach to Compromise. And for anyone who's ever dealt with a narcissist in their life, this article really sheds some light on why compromise can feel like such an impossible feat. So I guess to kick things off, let's start with the basics. What exactly is compromise?
Well, at its core, compromise is about finding common ground. It's about recognizing that everyone has different needs and perspectives. And sometimes you got to be willing to adjust your own desires a bit to create an outcome that works for everyone involved.
Right. It's about picking your battles. You can't win them all, right?
Exactly.
And the article even points out that our willingness to compromise is often shaped by, our upbringing, our experiences, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that makes me wonder, what happens when someone's entire worldview is built around winning,
Yeah.
around being right all the time? How does a narcissist even approach this whole concept of compromise?
That's a great question. And it's something that the article really delves into. For a narcissist, compromise isn't just inconvenient. It's a threat to their very sense of self.
Oh.
They see it as a sign of weakness, a chink in their armor of superiority.
So they never compromise.
It's rare. It's rarely about logic or long-term benefits. Because you got to remember, with narcissists, we're talking about a deeply ingrained psychological pattern. That need to maintain a sense of control and superiority is paramount for them.
So it's not just that they avoid compromise, but the article also mentions that they often demand it from others, even when their requests are completely unreasonable.
Oh, absolutely. It's a one-way street. They expect everyone else to bend over backwards, but they're completely inflexible.
So it's like a double whammy.
Yeah.
Not only are they unwilling to compromise, but they expect everyone else to cater to their every whim.
Yeah, it can be incredibly frustrating. And this dynamic can really play out in all sorts of relationships, from romantic partnerships to families to professional settings.
Right. And the article specifically mentions divorce settlements as a prime example. I can only imagine how that would be a total nightmare.
Yeah, you try negotiating a fair agreement with someone who sees any concession as like a personal attack. The article describes cases where narcissists have actually ended up losing significantly more in a settlement just because they couldn't bring themselves to compromise.
Wow. So they're cutting off their nose to spite their face.
Exactly. They'd rather fight to the bitter end, even if it means hurting themselves in the process.
But if they're so focused on winning, wouldn't they be able to see that they're ultimately losing in these situations?
It's not always about the practical outcome. It's about maintaining that sense of control, that sense of having the upper hand. Even if they end up worse off financially, they might still feel a sense of victory because they didn't give in.
That's a pretty messed up way of looking at things. And speaking of messed up, the article also talks about this tactic that narcissists use called bait and switch. Can you explain what that is?
Oh yeah, bait and switch. That's a classic narcissist move. It starts with them seemingly making a concession, appearing willing to compromise, just to lure you into a false sense of security.
So they dangle a carrot in front of you,
Precisely.
make you think they're willing to meet you halfway?
And then comes the switch. Once they've got you thinking they're being reasonable, they hit you with a much larger, often totally unreasonable demand.
So you're like, wait a minute, that's not what we agreed on.
And then they get to play the victim. They accuse you of being uncooperative and unfair.
So they get to have their cake and eat it too.
It's a brilliant, albeit incredibly frustrating tactic, and it's one that many people who've dealt with narcissists will recognize instantly.
It really is eye-opening how calculated this behavior can be. So we've seen how this plays out in high-stakes situations like divorces. But how about in more everyday scenarios? Like what happens when you're stuck working on a project with a coworker who exhibits these traits? Or dealing with a family member who refuses to budge on even the smallest decisions?
That's a great question, and it's one that we'll definitely explore further after a quick break.
All right, so we were talking about how a narcissist's inability to compromise can really blow up in these like high-stakes situations like divorce settlements.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious about how this dynamic plays out in like more everyday scenarios. Like what happens when you're stuck working on a project with a coworker? who exhibits these traits. Or dealing with a family member who refuses to budge on, even the smallest decisions.
Oh, it can be incredibly draining. Just imagine trying to collaborate on a project with someone who just shoots down every idea that isn't their own, or insists on micromanaging every single detail.
Oh yeah, I can totally see how that would create a super toxic work environment. It'd be like constantly walking on eggshells, afraid to speak up or offer any suggestions.
Exactly. And the same goes for family dynamics. A narcissist's refusal to compromise can turn even simple decisions, like where to go for dinner or what to watch on TV, into these huge battlegrounds.
Oh yeah.
They might sulk or throw tantrums when they don't get their way, or they might try to guilt trip or manipulate others into giving in to their demands.
So it's not just about them refusing to compromise. It's also about the tactics they use to try and force their will on everyone else.
Absolutely. And it's those tactics that can be so damaging in the long run. It creates this atmosphere of resentment and these power imbalances where one person's needs are constantly prioritized over everyone else's.
And in the article, there was this mention of how some lawyers actually use a narcissist's mindset to their advantage in legal cases. That sounds almost counterintuitive. How does that even work?
Yeah, it's a fascinating strategy, and it really highlights just how deeply ingrained this need for control is. In a narcissist's psyche, skilled lawyers who've dealt with these types of personalities, they know that sometimes appealing to logic or fairness just won't work.
So they have to play a different game altogether?
In a sense, yes. They might frame things in a way that makes the narcissist feel like they're winning or getting the upper hand, even if the outcome is ultimately a fair compromise. It's about appealing to their ego and their need to feel superior.
So it's like they're using the narcissist's own weaknesses against them.
Yeah, precisely. It's a delicate balance. But when done effectively, it can sometimes lead to a more equitable resolution for everyone involved.
It's amazing how understanding the psychology behind narcissism can actually be used to navigate these complex situations. But I'm sure for many people who've dealt with narcissists in their personal lives, it can feel incredibly disempowering, like you're constantly being manipulated and controlled. What advice would you give to someone who's stuck in this kind of dynamic?
That's a really important question. And it's crucial to remember that you're not alone. Narcissistic behavior is more common than many people realize, and it can be incredibly challenging to deal with. The first step is recognizing the patterns and understanding that you can't change a narcissist. You can't reason with them or appeal to their empathy, because in many cases, that empathy simply isn't there.
So it's not about trying to fix them. It's about protecting yourself.
Exactly. It's about setting clear boundaries, communicating your needs assertively, and refusing to engage in their games of manipulation.
But that's easier said than done right, especially when you're dealing with a family member or someone you're in a close relationship with.
You're absolutely right. It can be incredibly difficult, and it often requires a lot of strength and self-awareness. And sometimes the healthiest choice might be to distance yourself from the relationship altogether.
It sounds like the key takeaway here is that while compromise is essential for healthy relationships, it takes two willing participants.
Exactly. And if you're dealing with someone who consistently refuses to meet you halfway, it's important to recognize that it's not a reflection of your worth or your ability to compromise. It's a reflection of their own deeply ingrained patterns of behavior.
This whole conversation has been incredibly insightful. I think we often hear the term narcissist thrown around, but understanding the real-world implications of this personality type and how it affects their ability to compromise can be truly eye-opening. So we've talked about the negative side of this dynamic, but I'm curious, could there ever be situations where a narcissist's unwillingness to compromise could actually be an advantage?
That's a really interesting question. There are definitely times when standing firm in your beliefs, even when others are pushing back, can be beneficial. Think about historical figures who fought for social justice, or activists who challenged the status quo. Their unwavering commitment to their cause often required them to refuse to compromise on their core values.
This is not always a negative trait.
Right.
It really depends on the context and the motivations behind it.
Exactly. There's a fine line between healthy assertiveness and a narcissist's rigid refusal to budge. It's about discerning the difference between standing up for what you believe in and simply refusing to acknowledge any perspective other than your own.
And that brings up a crucial point. How can we learn to differentiate between healthy boundaries and a narcissist's manipulative tactics? How do we know when to stand our ground and when to walk away?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we figure out, when we're dealing with someone who's genuinely standing up for their principles versus someone who's just trying to manipulate the situation to get their way? It's definitely a skill, one that takes time and practice to develop. But one key difference I've noticed is that Someone with healthy boundaries can usually articulate their reasoning clearly and respectfully, even if you disagree with them. They're open to hearing your perspective, even if they don't change their mind. A narcissist, on the other hand, is often driven by that need to be right, to win at all costs. They'll often resort to personal attacks, gaslighting, or other forms of manipulation just to shut down any dissent.
So it's not just about like what they're saying, it's about how they say it and how they react when you push back.
Exactly. Pay attention to their emotional state, their body language. Are they getting defensive or angry when you challenge their viewpoint? Are they trying to make you feel guilty or ashamed for having a different opinion? Those are pretty big red flags.
That makes sense. And I imagine it's especially tricky when you're in a situation where you have to like maintain a relationship with this person, like if it's a coworker or a family member.
Oh, absolutely. In those cases, it's crucial to set clear boundaries and protect your own well-being. You can't force someone to change, but you can control how you react to their behavior.
And sometimes the best course of action might be to just distance yourself from the relationship entirely.
It's not an easy decision, but sometimes it's the healthiest choice, especially if the relationship is causing you significant stress, or if you've tried everything you can to set those boundaries, and nothing seems to be working.
It sounds like there's no one-size-fits-all answer here. It really depends on the situation and the people involved.
Right.
But just having this awareness, understanding how a narcissist's aversion to compromise can play out, can be so empowering.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power.
Well said. And for anyone listening who wants to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend checking out the Narcissistic Abuse Network. They have tons of great information and support available. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this one final thought. You know, we've explored the dark side of a narcissist's inability to compromise. But could there ever be like a flip side to this coin? Could there be situations where this unwavering stance, this refusal to budge, might actually lead to positive outcomes?
That's a really interesting question. And it's definitely one worth pondering. I mean, there are times when a strong sense of conviction, even when you're facing opposition, can be a powerful force for good.
Right, like think about historical figures who stood up against injustice, or activists who fought tirelessly for social change. Their unwillingness to compromise on their core values often paved the way for progress.
Exactly. It's all about context and intent. When this unwavering stance is rooted in genuine values and a desire to make a positive impact, it can be an incredible asset. But when it's driven by ego, a need for control, a refusal to even acknowledge any other perspective, that's when it becomes destructive.
So as always, it comes back to discernment, recognizing the difference between healthy assertiveness and a narcissist's manipulative tactics. It's so crucial.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive. I think we've all learned a lot today.
I know I have.
We've explored the nuances of compromise, the psychology of narcissism, and how these two forces can really collide in our everyday lives. So we hope you found this episode insightful and that it's given you maybe some food for thought as you navigate your own relationships and interactions. Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious.